Banished as a traitor, and left to die in the frozen wild, one forgotten Omega made a choice that would shake a kingdom. The heir, they claimed, was lost, was never stolen, he was abandoned. And she was the only one who heard him cry. Years later, the boy they tried to erase returns as a power no throne can control. Now the alphaking must kneel at the door of the woman he condemned, because the fate of his crown, his bloodline, and his legacy was saved by the very Omega he cast away. Rowan's presence was commanding without effort. Broad-shouldered and unyielding, he embodied everything Ashenfall worshipped. His rule had brought expansion, discipline, and prosperity. Yet it had also sharpened the lines between alphas, betas, and omegas into something unforgiving. To be alpha was to lead. To be beta was to serve efficiently. To be omega was to submit quietly. No exceptions were permitted, because exceptions threatened the illusion of control Rowan worked tirelessly to maintain. Ilara Vel had never fit into the narrow definition carved for her rank. As an omega, she was expected to soften rooms, to lower her gaze, to exist in supportive silence. Instead, she carried an unusual stillness that unsettled people. Her eyes observed too much. Her instincts anticipated shifts in mood before words were spoken. She sensed tensions in council chambers before arguments began. What others dismissed as weakness was, in truth, heightened perception. Yet Ashenfall had no language for an Omega whose strength was not decorative. Whispers followed her wherever she walked. Defective, some called her, because she did not flinch under scrutiny. Unnatural, others suggested, because she never displayed the timid compliance expected of her kind. She did not challenge openly. She simply endured without bending. That quiet endurance unsettled the hierarchy more than rebellion ever could. The rigid culture of Ashenfall thrived on public reinforcement of order. Ceremonies displayed alpha dominance with deliberate spectacle. Omega stood in ceremonial lines, heads bowed, reinforcing their place. Corrections for perceived disrespect were delivered in front of gathered witnesses, not to injure, but to remind. Humiliation was considered educational. Compliance was praised. Individual complexity was erased. It was during the coldest week of winter that the kingdom's fragile certainty fractured. Prince Calum Halchrist, the only heir to the throne, vanished from his guarded chambers before dawn. The palace erupted into controlled chaos. Search parties spread through the fortress and beyond its walls. Servants were interrogated. Guards were questioned. The air thickened with suspicion. Rowan's composure did not crack publicly, but grief hollowed his gaze. The heir was not merely his son, he was the continuation of bloodline and legacy. Without Calum, Ashenfall's stability would tremble. The council assembled within hours, their concern wrapped in polished strategy. Among them stood Chancellor Magnus Dreyer, whose calm efficiency masked calculation. He urged immediate action, immediate blame, immediate restoration of order. Panic, he argued, would signal weakness to rival packs. It did not take long for suspicion to shift toward Ilara. She had been assigned to assist in the palace wing near the prince's chambers the previous evening. A guard claimed he saw her walking alone after curfew. A servant insisted she had asked unusual questions about patrol rotations days earlier. None of it proved conspiracy, but in a kingdom desperate for explanation, coincidence hardened into accusation. Evidence appeared with unsettling convenience. A torn scrap of fabric matching Ilara's cloak was discovered near a servant's exit. A vial of sleeping herbs, common among healers yet suddenly suspicious, was found in her quarters. The council presented these findings not as possibilities, but as conclusions. Their logic was simple and cruel. An Omega with unusual instincts must harbor hidden ambition. Elara stood before the throne beneath the weight of dozens of eyes. She did not tremble. She did not beg. She explained calmly that she had no reason to harm the heir, that her presence near the chambers had been routine duty. Her voice carried clarity rather than panic, and that composure was interpreted as coldness. The more rational she sounded, the more convinced they became that she concealed something. Rowan listened from the throne carved of black stone. Grief clouded judgment, and pride shielded him from doubt. He saw only the possibility that he had misjudged her character. He saw vulnerability in the idea that his court had been infiltrated under his command. Investigating thoroughly would require patience and humility, and both felt impossible while his son remained missing. The council pressed for decisive action. Delay would signal weakness. The kingdom needed certainty. Rowan's jaw tightened as he weighed perception against proof. In that moment, he chose authority over inquiry. Without granting trial or deeper examination, he declared Elara guilty of treason against the crown. The sentence was exile beyond the frosted borderlands, a territory where winter never relented and survival required strength beyond rank. It was a punishment reserved for enemies Ashenfall wished to forget. Elara's heartbreak did not bloom when the verdict was spoken. It settled slowly as she looked toward Rowan and realized he did not search her face for truth. He did not hesitate long enough to question the narrative handed to him. What fractured inside her was not fear of exile. It was the recognition that the king she had quietly respected valued order more than justice. She was escorted through the gates before dusk, her cloak insufficient against the descending cold. No ceremony marked her departure. No acknowledgement of years served within palace walls was offered. The gates closed with mechanical finality, sealing her beyond protection and memory. Within Ashenfall, the narrative solidified quickly. The traitorous Omega had been dealt with. Stability was restored. Beyond the border, the world stretched silent and white. The frosted borderlands swallowed sound beneath thick drifts of snow. Wind carved restless patterns across the landscape, erasing tracks as quickly as they formed. Elara walked without looking back. Survival demanded forward motion. Yet as the fortress walls faded into distance, unease threaded through her thoughts. The accusations had felt orchestrated, too precise in timing, too convenient in discovery. Her instincts, the same instincts that had once unsettled Ashenfall, stirred with quiet warning. The heir's disappearance had not felt like chaos. It had felt deliberate. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying something faint and fragile through the frozen air. Elara paused, breath suspended. At first she thought it was imagination shaped by loneliness. Then it came again, barely audible, but unmistakable. A child's cry, thin and trembling, drifted across the wilderness. And in that sound, the certainty of her exile shattered into something far more dangerous. The cry came again, thinner this time, nearly swallowed by the restless wind sweeping across the frosted borderlands. Elara stood motionless, allowing her sharpened senses to guide her rather than her doubt. The sound did not belong to the wilderness. It was fragile, human, desperate. Without hesitation, she turned toward it, pushing through drifts of snow that rose nearly to her knees. The cold bit through her cloak, but urgency burned hotter than the frost. She followed the uneven rhythm of the sound until she reached a shallow ravine partially hidden beneath wind-carved ice. There, half buried in snow and wrapped in royal blue fabric, unmistakable even beneath frost, lay Prince Calum Helcrest. His small body trembled violently, breath shallow and uneven. Ice clung to his lashes. His hands were stiff with cold, fingers curled as if grasping for something that had already vanished. For a moment, Elara could only stare. The heir was not kidnapped. He was discarded. The placement was too exposed, too deliberate. No struggle marked the snow around him. No predator tracks circled nearby. Whoever left him here had not feared interruption. They had intended the wilderness to finish what they began. The realization cut sharply through her exhaustion. This was no accident, no reckless escape. It was a quiet execution disguised as disappearance. Elara knelt immediately, brushing snow from the prince's face. His pulse fluttered weakly beneath her touch. Anger flickered inside her, fierce and immediate. The kingdom had cast her out as traitor, while its true enemy moved freely within palace walls. For a fleeting heartbeat, bitterness whispered that this child belonged to the king who had condemned her without listening. She owed Ashenfall nothing. But as Calum's fragile breath faltered again, vengeance dissolved. He was innocent of council schemes and royal pride. He was only a child, abandoned to freeze. Mercy rose stronger than resentment. Carefully, she wrapped him inside her cloak, pressing him against her chest to share warmth. His body was frighteningly light. The journey through the snow would demand strength she was not certain she possessed, yet she lifted him without hesitation. Each step back through the wilderness felt heavier, the wind resisting her as if testing her resolve. An abandoned hunter's cabin rested several miles beyond the ravine, a structure she had noticed earlier while searching for shelter. Its wooden frame leaned slightly under the weight of snow, but its roof remained intact. Reaching it required navigating uneven terrain and hidden ice patches, and more than once Elara nearly stumbled. Each time, she tightened her hold around Calum, refusing to let him slip from her arms. Inside the cabin, the air was stale but dry. A broken cot leaned against one wall. A rusted iron stove stood near the center, its pipe extending through the roof. She laid Calum gently upon the cot and moved quickly, gathering old timber stacked outside beneath an overhang. Her fingers trembled as she struck flint against steel. Sparks resisted at first, then finally caught. Flame blossomed, small but determined. But as Calum's fragile breath faltered again, vengeance dissolved. He was innocent of council schemes and royal pride. He was only a child, abandoned to freeze. Mercy rose stronger than resentment. Carefully, she wrapped him inside her cloak, pressing him against her chest to share warmth. His body was frighteningly light. The journey through the snow would demand strength she was not certain she possessed, yet she lifted him without hesitation. Each step back through the wilderness felt heavier, the wind resisting her as if testing her resolve. An abandoned hunter's cabin rested several miles beyond the ravine, a structure she had noticed earlier while searching for shelter. Its wooden frame leaned slightly under the weight of snow, but its roof remained intact. Reaching it required navigating uneven terrain and hidden ice patches, and more than once Elara nearly stumbled. Each time, she tightened her hold around Calum, refusing to let him slip from her arms. Inside the cabin, the air was stale but dry. A broken cot leaned against one wall. A rusted iron stove stood near the center, its pipe extending through the roof. She laid Calum gently upon the cot and moved quickly, gathering old timber stacked outside beneath an overhang. Her fingers trembled as she struck flint against steel. Sparks resisted at first, then finally caught. Flame blossomed, small but determined. Something unusual stirred in those moments. When she placed her hand lightly against his forehead to check his temperature, a subtle warmth pulsed beneath her palm. Not the heat of fever, but something deeper. His dormant alpha energy, still forming, seemed to respond specifically to her presence. The air between them shifted faintly, as though acknowledging connection. Elara sensed it but did not recoil. She had always been attuned to currents others ignored. If anything, the bond steadied him. His breathing deepened whenever she remained near. His restless movements eased. Far beyond the frosted borderlands, Ashenfall tightened its narrative. King Rowan publicly declared that extended search efforts would compromise territorial defenses. He announced that the heir had likely been taken beyond their reach, and ordered patrols scaled back to avoid signaling weakness to rival packs. Outwardly, the kingdom accepted his decision. Privately, whispers multiplied. Within council chambers, Chancellor Magnus Dreyer expressed measured regret while quietly reinforcing the idea that Elara had acted alone. Stability, he insisted, required closure. Rowan allowed himself to believe the matter was resolved. Admitting uncertainty would reopen doubt about his judgment. Back in the cabin, Elara pieced together implications. The prince's placement in the ravine had been calculated. The absence of chaos suggested inside access. Whoever orchestrated the disappearance possessed authority and confidence. Her exile had removed the potential witness, someone perceptive enough to question inconsistencies. The more Calum regained strength, the more determined she became to protect him not only from winter, but from the kingdom that had failed him. She crafted a simple wooden pendant bearing no royal crest, determined that no visible symbol would betray his identity. She taught him small survival tasks appropriate to his age, framing them as games so he would not sense the weight of necessity. One evening, as she returned from checking traps, the air felt wrong. The wilderness carried scents differently in winter, sharp and distinct. Beneath the usual notes of pine and frost, another trace lingered, foreign, deliberate. She stilled, allowing instinct to surface fully. It was not the wandering scent of predators. It was controlled, masked, trained. Elara's gaze shifted toward the southern horizon, where Ashenfall lay beyond miles of snow and silence. Someone had crossed into the borderlands. Someone patient enough to follow a fading royal scent, and they were getting closer. Winter loosened its grip by degrees, never truly leaving the frosted borderlands, but retreating enough to expose patches of dark earth and brittle grass beneath the snow. The cabin remained a scar on the wilderness, half swallowed by drift and wind, yet inside it had become something close to a home. Months had passed since Elara first carried Prince Calum Halcrest through the ravine, and in that time survival shifted into routine, then into quiet structure. The days were still hard, but no longer desperate. The fire stayed lit. Food appeared more reliably. The boy's cheeks filled out again, his steps steadier, his eyes brighter with each sunrise that did not end in tragedy. Elara kept him hidden not only from the kingdom, but from the very concept of it. She did not speak of crowns or courtrooms or the throne that waited behind stone walls. Names were dangerous, and truth was sharp enough to cut even when meant kindly. In the borderlands, he was simply Calum, a child who learned the sound of thawing ice and the patience of setting traps, who counted time by the rhythm of storms rather than by palace bells. Yet secrecy did not mean distance. If anything, isolation carved their bond deeper. Elara had never intended to become anyone's sanctuary, and yet the role settled on her with strange inevitability. She learned the quiet language of his needs before he could name them, recognizing when hunger was really fear, when silence meant overwhelm rather than obedience. In return, Caleb began to track her presence as if she were a compass. When she left the cabin for too long, his restlessness rose. When she returned, his shoulders eased in a way that felt instinctual, not learned. The connection between them did not resemble the expected Omega submission Ashenfall preached. It felt older than rank, like an oath written into blood and breath. At times, Elara sensed his emotions as if they were echoes inside her own chest. She would wake before he cried from nightmares, already moving toward him. He would calm the moment her hand brushed his hair, not because he had been commanded to settle, but because his body trusted her without question. It was almost unsettling the way the wilderness itself seemed to hush when they were close, as if even the wind respected the bond forming between them. Elara shaped him carefully, not with dominance, but with steadiness. She did not teach him that power meant control. She taught him that power meant responsibility. When frustration surged, she guided him to breathe through it. When fear made him tremble, she showed him how to name it internally, to let it pass through him rather than rule him. She did not punish outbursts with humiliation, because humiliation only bred hidden rage. Instead, she gave him structure, routines, quiet discipline, tasks that built confidence rather than entitlement. In Ashenfall, Alpha heirs were trained to command early. Their emotions were sharpened into weapons, their compassion treated as weakness. Elara had seen it in the palace halls long before Caleb vanished. She had watched young alphas learn that shouting won respect, that intimidation was strength. She had seen beta shrink under it and omegas disappear beneath it. Here, in the borderlands, she gave Caleb something entirely different. She taught him how to listen before reacting, how to measure consequences. How to recognize that fear in others was not an invitation to crush them. Caleb absorbed those lessons with quiet intensity. Even as a child, he carried something heavy inside him, an awareness that the world beyond the borderlands mattered, even if he could not explain why. Sometimes he stared out the cabin's small window toward the south, his expression distant, as if sensing a pull he did not yet understand. Elara never corrected him. She simply remained close, letting him feel safe enough to wonder. But safety in the borderlands was always temporary. The wilderness could be managed, predicted in patterns of weather and hunger. People, however, were unpredictable, and Elara knew someone would eventually come. A kingdom built on dominance did not tolerate loose ends. The first sign arrived one evening as the sun dipped low, staining the snow with faint amber. Elara returned from gathering roots and felt the air sharpen with warning. The cabin was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of routine, but the tense quiet of disturbance. She stopped several yards from the door, scanning the ground. Footprints, not hers, not Caleb's, narrow, deliberate impressions, spaced with training rather than wandering. She did not rush inside. She circled wide, keeping to the tree line, letting her instincts map the threat. Smoke still rose from the chimney, meaning the fire had not been extinguished. Someone wanted the cabin to look normal. Someone expected her to come in without thinking. Elara's heart tightened, not from fear for herself, but from the image of Caleb alone inside. She reached beneath her cloak and gripped the small blade she kept hidden there, not as a weapon of violence, but as a tool, a last defense. She moved quietly, stepping where snow was thickest to muffle sound. When she reached the window, she angled her view just enough to see inside. Two figures stood near the hearth. Their cloaks were dark, their posture controlled. They did not appear like desperate hunters. They stood like men who belonged to an organized system. One held something in his hand, turning it thoughtfully as if deciding how long to wait. Calum sat on the cot, still, watching them with a kind of contained alertness that made Elara's chest ache. He looked smaller than he had that morning, as if the presence of strangers had shrunk the room around him. Yet he did not cry. He did not plead. He simply observed the way Elara had taught him. Elara did not burst through the door. She created distraction first, tossing a stone hard against the far side of the cabin. The sound cracked sharp through the air. One figure shifted instantly, moving toward the back wall to investigate. The other remained, but his focus flickered. That was enough. Elara entered swiftly, not with noise, but with precision. She positioned herself between the strangers and Calum without hesitation, body angled to shield the boy. Her gaze locked onto theirs, steady, unreadable. The men stiffened, surprised not by her return but by the calm in her posture. They had expected an Omega to panic. They had expected weakness. The moment stretched, thick with calculation. The stranger closest to her stepped forward slightly, testing the space. Elara did not advance. She did not retreat. She simply held the line, forcing them to recognize that reaching Calum would require going through her first. Her mind moved quickly, scanning for exits, noting how close the stove stood, how heavy the cabin's iron poker was, how the floorboards creaked in certain places. She did not need brute force. She needed advantage. The second figure returned from the back, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. There was recognition there, not personal familiarity, but awareness of who she was supposed to be. The banished Omega. The convenient scapegoat. The mistake they thought had already been erased. Elara's suspicion hardened into certainty. These were not random predators. These were not bandits. They were sent. And, if they had come this far, it meant someone inside Ashenfall wanted Calum silenced permanently. The tension snapped when one man moved too quickly, reaching toward the cot. Elara reacted instantly, swinging the iron poker from the hearth with controlled force, not to maim, but to halt. The metal struck the floor close enough to startle him back, the sound echoing like a warning bell in the small room. Calum flinched, but he did not scream. His eyes stayed locked on Elara, trusting her. The men recalculated. They were armed, but they had not expected resistance. Elara used that hesitation. She kicked a bucket of melted snow water toward the hearth, forcing steam to rise and blur visibility for a heartbeat. In that moment, she pulled Calum behind her, guiding him toward the side door, her hand firm at his shoulder. The movement was seamless, practiced from months of imagining this exact threat. As they reached the doorway, one man lunged again, catching Elara's arm with a sharp strike. Pain flashed, hot and immediate, slicing through her forearm. She did not cry out. She did not allow the sound to frighten Calum. She tightened her jaw and shoved the man back with her shoulder, using his momentum against him. The injury stung, but she treated it like weather, something to endure, not something to surrender to. Something changed then. The air in the cabin thickened, vibrating with pressure that did not belong to Elara. Calum's breath hitched, and for a second his eyes glowed with a faint unnatural intensity. A wave of alpha presence pulsed outward, raw and untrained, but unmistakably powerful. The men froze, their bodies reacting instinctively to dominance far greater than their own. Ilara felt it too, not as threat but as protective instinct radiating from the boy. His power did not flare to control her. It flared to defend her. She swallowed the shock and forced calm into her expression, lowering her injured arm as if nothing had happened. She would not allow him to see her bleeding. If he panicked, he might unleash more power without control. If he feared himself, he might break under the weight of what he was. Ilara guided him out into the cold, keeping her steps steady as the cabin door slammed behind them. The wind hit hard, but it also offered cover. Snow erased evidence quickly, and she intended to use the wilderness the way her enemies could not. As they ran, her mind sharpened around one brutal truth. They could not stay hidden forever. The cabin had been discovered. The pursuit would not stop. The kingdom would not let its heir live outside its control. Hours later, after they finally paused beneath a thick stand of pines, Ilara checked her injury in secret. Blood had soaked through her sleeve. She tore fabric and bound it tightly, breathing through the sting without letting Caleb notice. Only when she searched the snow near the cabin's trail for anything left behind did she find the detail that made her stomach drop. A blade lay, half buried in the drift, abandoned in haste. Its hilt bore a carving she recognized instantly, even under frost, the royal crest of Ashenfall. And in that moment, Ilara understood the danger was not outside the kingdom, it was the kingdom itself. Ashenfall looked unchanged from the outside. Its towers still cut the sky with disciplined certainty. Its banners still snapped in the wind like declarations of strength. Patrols still marched in perfect patterns, and the marketplace still opened each morning as if routine could outlast grief. Yet, beneath the stone and ceremony, the kingdom had begun to rot. The disappearance of Prince Caleb had not only stolen the heir, it had exposed a crack in the image Rowan Halcrest had built his rule upon. Ashenfall depended on certainty, and certainty had vanished with the child. Rowan responded the only way he knew how. He tightened control until the air inside the fortress felt thinner to breathe. He increased border inspections, raised penalties for disobedience, and demanded public pledges of loyalty from households that had served the crown for generations. Wolves learned to speak more carefully. Servants learned to keep their eyes down longer than before. The palace became a place where silence was mistaken for stability. Rowan's grief did not soften him. It armored him, and that armor turned sharp at the edges. He did not allow extended searches for the heir, not because he lacked desperation, but because desperation made a king look vulnerable. The official story became fixed. The prince had been taken beyond reach, and the traitor responsible had been punished. The kingdom was expected to accept closure as loyalty. Any lingering questions were treated as a threat to unity. In the council chamber, Beta Chancellor Magnus Dreyer watched all of it with a calm that seemed almost compassionate. He held Rowan's anger like a tool, guiding it without appearing to touch it. Magnus was not the loudest voice in the room. He did not need to be. His influence lived in suggestion rather than command, in carefully framed options that always led to the same outcome. He had risen to chancellor through intellect and patience, never reaching beyond his rank publicly, never violating tradition overtly. Yet power gathered around him the way shadow gathered around firelight. Magnus understood something Rowan did not. Grief made a king predictable. He had orchestrated the heir's disappearance with the precision of a strategist, not the chaos of a criminal. He had not needed to lay hands on the prince himself. He only needed access, and access was easy for someone placed in the center of court operations. Magnus had arranged for guards to be reassigned, for patrol routes to shift, for a single servant to deliver a message that would draw attention away at the right moment. He had built the illusion of a kidnapping while ensuring the truth remained buried in wilderness snow. If the prince died, succession could be managed. If Rowan broke under loss, the council could claim stability required different leadership. Either outcome served Magnus. The scapegoat had been essential. Ashenfall needed someone to blame so it would not look inward. Elara Vale had been perfect, and Omega with unusual instincts made an easy target. Magnus had directed suspicion toward her with subtlety, planting evidence that felt just plausible enough to satisfy a grieving king. He had watched Rowan exile her without trial, not with triumph on his face, but with quiet satisfaction. A perceptive witness removed. A king emotionally compromised. A kingdom craving certainty. The board had been set. Rowan, believing he had acted decisively, became harsher by the week. The council presented his tightening rule as strength, but the pack felt the difference. Loyalty became fear. Discipline became oppression. Rowan's authority remained intact, yet it grew increasingly isolated, as though even the stone halls could sense that his reign was no longer guided by clarity, but by wounded pride. Far from that fortress, Elara moved through the borderlands with a boy at her side and a secret heavy enough to bend the future. After fleeing the cabin, she traveled deeper into terrain where few dared to follow. She found shelter in the ruins of an old watchpost abandoned long ago, its walls partially collapsed but still offering protection from wind. There she tended her injury in private, keeping her composure steady whenever Calum looked at her. She refused to let fear leak into him. She spoke in calm instructions, in structured routines, in the language of survival that had become their normal. When the storms quieted enough for her to return briefly toward the cabin's trail, she retrieved what the assassins left behind. She did it cautiously, methodically, searching not for supplies but for truth. The royal crest carved into the blade was only the beginning. A torn strip of cloth bore the faint scent of palace dye, the kind reserved for official guards. A small wax seal, cracked but recognizable, carried the mark used for council messages. Each piece was proof that the threat-hunting Calum was not an outside enemy. It was Ashenfall itself. Elara stored the items carefully, wrapping them in oiled cloth to keep them from moisture. Proof was fragile in the wilderness. So was her resolve. At night, when Calum slept, she stared at the gathered evidence until her eyes burned. Returning to Ashenfall would mean stepping back into the kingdom that had condemned her. It would mean trusting Rowan to see past his own pride. It would mean risking Calum's safety inside walls where betrayal had already reached him once. But staying hidden meant surrendering the kingdom to Magnus and the council's corruption. It meant letting Ashenfall harden into something worse. A place where power strangled everything gentle until only dominance remained. The debate tore at her quietly. She had learned to survive without Ashenfall. She had learned to live with the fact that Rowan had not believed her. Yet she could not ignore the truth that Calum belonged to more than wilderness refuge. He carried a destiny that would one day pull him south no matter how fiercely she resisted. Keeping him hidden forever was not protection. It was delay. That truth became harder to avoid as Calum grew older and sharper. His questions began softly, tucked into moments that seemed casual. He would watch the horizon too long, and then glance at Ilara as if waiting for permission to wonder. He would ask why strangers had come to the cabin, why they had looked afraid when he felt something rise inside him. Why Ilara sometimes stared at the south as if the land itself held unfinished business. Eventually, the question came in the simplest form, asked with the steady seriousness only a child could hold. He wondered about his father. Ilara's chest tightened, not with anger, but with something far more complicated. Rowan Halcrest was the man who had condemned her to die, yet he was also Calum's father, the center of the boy's inheritance and identity. Ilara could not poison Calum with hatred without poisoning him against himself, yet she also could not pretend the truth was gentle. She chose care instead of cruelty. She spoke of Rowan indirectly, not as monster, not as hero, but as a powerful man shaped by tradition and fear. She framed him as a king who believed strength required certainty, a man who had been wounded by loss and had made choices from that wound. Ilara did not excuse him. She simply refused to let her pain become Calum's burden. That restraint cost her. Love had grown in her for the child she protected, a love deeper than rank, deeper than logic. It had also grown into something dangerous, a desire to keep him near, to preserve the quiet world they had built together, where he was safe and seen. But destiny did not care about comfort. Destiny demanded movement, demanded confrontation, demanded truth. Ilara understood that if Calum returned to Ashenfall unprepared, he would become what the kingdom expected, a weapon shaped by dominance. The only way to protect him from that fate was not to hide him forever, but to prepare him to face it with balance. So she began training him differently. She strengthened his discipline, teaching him to focus his alpha presence rather than unleash it. She taught him strategy through survival choices, showing him how to read terrain, how to anticipate opponents, how to recognize when patience was more powerful than force. She taught him to observe people the way she always had, to notice who benefited from chaos, who spoke too smoothly, who avoided direct answers. If Ashenfall demanded an alpha heir, she would ensure it received one who could not be easily manipulated, while Ilara prepared the boy for eventual return. Magnus Dryal tightened his grip inside the palace. He arranged advisors around Rowan, whispering that grief made rulers vulnerable to traitors. He pushed new decrees that centralized authority into the council's hands for stability. Wolves began to see that Rowan's throne remained, but the kingdom's direction had shifted toward the chancellor's quiet control. Then came the moment Magnus had both anticipated and feared. A report arrived from the outer patrols, vague at first, easily dismissed, yet too persistent to ignore. Scouts had detected unusual movement across the frosted borderlands, tracks that suggested organized travel rather than wandering, and, stranger still, the faint trace of a scent that matched the royal bloodline, appearing like a ghost on the wind. Magnus listened without changing expression, but inside him calculation sharpened into alarm. The heir was supposed to be gone. The wilderness was supposed to erase him. If Calum still lived, every plan Magnus had built would become far more dangerous. And as the report ended, Magnus Dryer's calm finally tightened into something colder than patience. Because for the first time he realized the truth had not died in the snow. It had been carried away by the very Omega he thought he had erased. Seasons turned in the borderlands the way they always had, without ceremony and without mercy. Winter receded into a brief, sharp spring, then yielded to a summer that never fully warmed the earth. Even the sunlight felt distant here, filtered through thin clouds and constant wind. Yet time did what even the harshest landscape could not prevent. Calum grew. The child Elara, once carried through snowdrifts, became a boy with steady shoulders, long-limbed strength, and eyes that had learned to weigh a room before moving within it. Elara measured his growth in practical ways, not sentimental ones. She noticed how his breathing stayed controlled when storms battered their shelter. She noticed how he no longer startled at the sudden crack of ice. She noticed how his hands, once clumsy with tools, now set traps with precision and cleaned game with calm focus. But more than anything, she noticed the way he handled emotion. Ashenfall would have demanded he crush it, bury it, weaponize it. Elara had taught him to understand it, to name it internally, to let it inform him without ruling him. Their refuge had shifted again over the years. The ruined watchpost became too known to the land, too predictable, so Elara moved them when instinct warned her. They lived lightly, leaving little evidence behind. They learned which streams ran clean and which forests held enough cover. Their lives formed a quiet rhythm of travel and return, always staying just far enough from settled trails to remain unseen. Elara trained him not like an heir, but like someone who would one day have to survive betrayal. She taught strategy using the wilderness as her lesson board. She showed him how the most dangerous threat was rarely the loudest. She taught him to watch for patterns in movement, to recognize when something looked too orderly to be natural. She spoke about empathy not as softness, but as information. Understanding another's fear, hunger, or ambition gave him advantage. It revealed motives. It exposed lies. Calum listened the way he did everything, with focus that bordered on intensity. His questions were sharper now, no longer childlike wondering but careful probing. He asked about Ashenfall without asking directly, studying Elara's expressions, as if trying to map the truth from what she did not say. Elara did not flood him with history. She offered enough to guide him, enough to keep him grounded, but she refused to let the kingdom's poison shape him too early. When she spoke of power, she spoke of restraint first, but power was rising in him regardless of what either of them wanted. It began subtly. The air changed when Calum stepped into certain spaces, as if the world adjusted to make room. Animals reacted first. Rabbits froze rather than fleeing. Wolves in the distance fell silent, their howls cutting off as though something larger had entered their awareness. Calum did not notice at first. Elara did. Her instincts recognized the shift the way a storm is recognized before thunder arrives. Then came the day his alpha aura manifested unmistakably. They had been traveling along a ridgeline when a pack of wild wolves emerged from the trees below. Not the desperate kind driven mad by hunger, but a coordinated group, moving in formation, eyes bright with intelligence. They did not attack. They did not circle in threat. They simply watched, heads lowered slightly, not in fear, but in recognition. Calum stepped forward without thinking, his posture calm, his gaze steady. The air pulsed. It was not aggression. It was presence. A pressure that rolled outward like a wave, forcing the world to acknowledge him. Elara felt it hit her skin, not as dominance meant to push her down, but as something raw and immense searching for alignment. The wolves reacted immediately. One by one, they lowered further, showing submission not to cruelty, but to authority they could not deny. Elara's breath caught. She had known Calum carried royal blood. But this was more than inheritance. It was something rarer, something the kingdom would have feared if it understood it. His aura was not simply alpha. It was inevitable. The kind of power that did not demand obedience with threats because it did not need to. It was the type that made others follow instinctively, not out of terror, but because resisting felt unnatural. After that day, wolves began appearing more often. Not only lone wanderers, but small groups from rogue packs that lived beyond Ashenfall's territory lines. They did not approach Elara directly. They lingered at the edges of camp, watching Calum with a reverence that unsettled the air. When Calum moved, they shifted with him. When he paused, they paused. It became clear they were not hunting him. They were gathering around him as if drawn by a signal they could not ignore. Rumors have a way of traveling even through wilderness. Traders who skirted the borderlands spoke in hushed tones of a young alpha out in the frostlands. One who walked with wolves like shadows and carried an aura that made hardened rogues lower their eyes. The story changed with each retelling, becoming half myth. Some said he was a spirit. Some said he was a curse. Some said he was the future. Those whispers reached places they were never meant to reach. In Ashenfall, King Rowan Halcrest sat in a palace that felt colder than it used to, surrounded by stone and silence and the constant weight of absence. His grief had calcified into strictness, his pride into isolation. He told himself he had done what was required. He told himself his decisions had preserved stability, yet the nights were restless, filled with a presence he could not name, an emptiness that felt active rather than hollow. Then, without warning, something shifted inside him. It began like a faint pressure beneath his ribs, a sensation he could not explain. It was not pain. It was resonance, like hearing a familiar note played far away. Rowan dismissed it at first as memory, as longing twisting his mind. But the sensation returned, stronger, more precise, pulling his attention south, then north, then toward the borderlands. The royal bond between bloodlines was not supposed to work at such distance, not without ritual, not without contact. Yet Rowan felt it anyway, a pulse that matched the rhythm of something living. The idea struck him like an accusation he had no defense against. If that resonance was real, it meant what he refused to consider. His heir might still exist somewhere beyond his walls. And if that was true, then his certainty had not been strength. It had been failure. Meanwhile, Chancellor Magnus Dreyer heard the same rumors through a different lens. To him, the whispers were not myth. They were threat. He had already tightened his hold over council operations, positioning allies in key guard posts, shifting finances, manipulating loyalty pledges. He had framed each move as necessary to protect Ashenfall during its succession uncertainty. In truth, he was preparing for a future where Rowan's authority could be challenged openly. But a living heir changed everything. A living heir meant Rowan's line continued. A living heir meant Magnus could no longer control succession through council decree. A living heir meant the kingdom might rally behind blood rather than politics. Magnus accelerated. He pushed the council to finalize contingency plans. He ordered silent patrol expansions into border territories under the guise of preventing rogue infiltration. He began quietly identifying which noble families would support him if Rowan collapsed, and which would need to be broken before they could resist. His calm remained, but beneath it, urgency sharpened into something almost desperate. Far from Ashenfall's plotting, Elara watched the changes in Calum and understood the danger increasing around them. His power was no longer something she could keep hidden. The wilderness itself was announcing him. Each time wolves gathered, each time the air thickened with his presence, it felt like a signal flaring into the sky. She could teach restraint, but she could not teach invisibility to someone whose very existence pulled others into orbit. Ilara's mind returned again and again to the items she had gathered. The royal crest on the blade, the wax seal, the palace die. Proof that the threat was internal. If Magnus and the council had tried once, they would try again. And now they would come with greater force, because time had made Calum not only a child to erase, but a rival to fear. She also sensed something else, a restless shifting beneath the surface of the kingdom she could not see, but could almost feel. Civil war did not begin with battle. It began with whispers, with factions forming, with loyalty splitting quietly in hallways. Ashenfall was built on hierarchy, and hierarchy cracked violently when uncertainty entered it. Rowan's harsh rule had created pressure. Magnus's manipulation had created rot. Calum's existence was the spark both men would fight over. Ilera had always believed survival meant avoiding conflict. Now she saw that avoiding conflict could also mean inviting it to grow stronger. If Ashenfall tore itself apart, Calum would be hunted, not as a prince, but as a symbol. And symbols were destroyed without mercy. One evening, as dusk spread across the borderlands, the air changed again. Ilara stood still, her senses stretching outward. It was not the scent of wolves this time. It was not the careful masking of assassins either. It was something heavier, more familiar, carrying authority like heat. Calum felt it too. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the horizon, as if hearing something deeper than sound. In Ashenfall, Rowan could no longer ignore the pull. He ordered his horse prepared without announcing it to the council. He did not ask permission. He did not explain. Something inside him demanded answers, demanded movement, demanded truth. And under a sky the color of steel, King Rowan Halcrest rode toward the frosted borderlands, following the same instinct that was pulling him straight back to the Omega he had banished. The frosted borderlands had a way of swallowing certainty. Even a king felt smaller beneath its endless sky. Rowan Halcrest rode alone for the final stretch, having dismissed his escort miles back under the pretense of reconnaissance. The truth was more complicated. Whatever waited ahead felt personal, not political. Authority would only cloud it. The pull had grown stronger the deeper he traveled north. It was no longer a faint resonance beneath his ribs, but a steady, undeniable rhythm. Each mile tightened it, sharpened it, until doubt became impossible. If he was wrong, he would face the humiliation alone. If he was right, everything he believed about his own decisions would fracture. Smoke curled faintly above a tree line in the distance. Not the careless smoke of travelers, but controlled, steady. Rowan slowed his horse, every instinct alert. He dismounted before approaching, boots sinking slightly into packed snow. The structure ahead was not the ruined watchtower he expected, but a small cabin reinforced with deliberate care. Whoever lived here had survived more than one winter. He stepped into the clearing without announcing himself. The cabin door opened before he reached it. Elaravel stood framed by dim interior light, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Time had altered her but not diminished her. The softness others once mistook for weakness had hardened into something quieter and more resolute. She did not bow. She did not recoil. She simply regarded him as one would regard an inevitable storm. Behind her, movement shifted. Rowan's breath faltered as a boy stepped into view. Calum Halcrest was no longer the fragile child Rowan last remembered. He stood straighter now, shoulders steady, gaze direct. His features were unmistakable. Rowan's own blood reflected back at him. But there was something else layered within that reflection. Control. Awareness, strength not sharpened by arrogance, but steadied by discipline. Shock struck first, raw and unguarded. It stripped the king from Rowan's posture, and left only a father staring at a living miracle. Disbelief followed, a desperate instinct to question his own senses, but the bond between bloodlines surged unmistakably, confirming what his eyes saw. Calum was alive, and pride, fierce and involuntary, collided with both. The air shifted around the boy, subtle but powerful. Rowan felt it immediately. The alpha presence radiating from Calum was not merely intact, it was formidable, stronger than it had any right to be at his age. Stronger, perhaps, than Rowan's own had been at the same stage, but it was not wild, it was not reckless, it was contained. Rowan's gaze flickered back to Elara. Understanding settled in slow and heavy. The wilderness had not spared his son. Someone had protected him, fed him, trained him, shielded him from hunters and from the elements. Elara had done what Ashenfall failed to do. She had preserved the heir the kingdom had abandoned. The silence between them carried more weight than accusation ever could. Rowan studied her carefully now, noticing details he once ignored. The faint scar along her forearm, the way she positioned herself half a step forward, instinctively shielding Calum without making it obvious. The steadiness in her breathing, disciplined and unafraid, his memory replayed the day he banished her. The confidence in his verdict, the way he had chosen decisiveness over doubt. He had believed he was protecting Ashenfall. Instead, he had exiled its only loyal guardian. Calum moved without hesitation, stepping forward until he stood directly between Rowan and Elara. The gesture was subtle, but unmistakable. It was not aggressive, it was protective. His posture remained respectful, but his presence flared faintly, enough to signal that any threat would meet resistance. Rowan felt the shift like a physical blow. His son did not fear him, but neither did he defer instinctively. The loyalty in Calum's stance leaned toward the Omega Rowan had condemned. The realization tightened something deep in Rowan's chest. Authority built on blood alone was fragile. Loyalty built on trust was unshakable. Rowan's internal conflict surged, pride wrestling with guilt. Pride urged him to reclaim control, to assert dominance, to re-establish the hierarchy Ashenfall understood. Guilt demanded acknowledgement of error. For the first time in years, Rowan felt uncertain in his own judgment. Elara broke the stalemate not with accusation, but with action. She stepped aside just enough to retrieve something from a wooden chest near the wall. She returned, holding the wrapped bundle she had guarded for years. Without ceremony, she placed it on the small table between them and unfolded the cloth. The blade with the royal crest gleamed faintly in the cabin light. The wax seal lay beside it. The strip of palace-dyed cloth completed the picture. Rowan did not need explanation. Recognition darkened his expression. The crest was authentic. The seal belonged to council correspondence. These were not relics forged by rebels. They were pieces of Ashenfall's own machinery. His mind moved quickly through possibilities, narrowing toward the one name that aligned too neatly with ambition and access: Magnus Dreyer. The realization was cold and precise. The Chancellor had been present during every discussion of the heir's disappearance. He had urged swift punishment. He had cautioned against prolonged search efforts. He had positioned himself as stabilizer, while Rowan's grief burned hot and blinding. Rowan's jaw tightened as memory rearranged itself under new light. Magnus's suggestions had always arrived at convenient moments. His counsel had always pointed toward consolidating authority under council oversight for protection. Rowan had interpreted it as loyalty. Now it resembled strategy. Elara did not gloat. She did not press advantage. She simply allowed the evidence to speak. Rowan felt the weight of his failure settle fully. He had wronged the only person who acted without self-interest. He had banished the Omega who saved his son while trusting the men who orchestrated betrayal. The pride that once protected him now felt hollow. Calum watched them both carefully, absorbing every subtle shift. His aura pulsed faintly, reacting to tension but not escalating it. He did not step aside. He remained between them, not as barrier but as balance. Outside, the wind shifted abruptly. Elara sensed it first, her gaze flicking toward the tree line. Rowan followed instinctively, stepping out of the cabin into the clearing. The air carried new scents, multiple, organized, advancing with discipline. Not rogues, riders. The distant thud of hooves reached them seconds later, steady and synchronized. Rowan recognized the pattern immediately. Council Guard formation. Not a patrol, an operation. Magnus had moved faster than expected. Rowan's hand tightened at his side, not in rage but in realization. The Chancellor had likely traced him the moment he left Ashenfall without formal escort. If Rowan confirmed the heir's survival, Magnus's plans would collapse. The solution would be simple and brutal. Eliminate uncertainty. King. Omega. Heir. 3 threats. 1 sweep. Elara stepped beside Rowan now, no longer separated by accusation or exile. Calum moved with them, his presence expanding subtly, sensing the approach as clearly as they did. Through the trees, dark shapes emerged, cloaks marked with Ashenfall's insignia. The council had not come to retrieve. They had come to erase. The first riders broke through the trees like a coordinated shadow, their horses trained to keep formation even in deep snow. Ashenfall insignia flashed against dark cloaks, and the sound of hooves felt less like travel and more like a verdict being delivered. Rowan read the scene in an instant. This was not a rescue party, not a loyal guard responding to the king's disappearance. Their spacing was too aggressive, their posture too intent. They rode with the certainty of men ordered to finish a task, not the caution of men seeking answers. Elara's instincts sharpened, mapping the clearing as if it were a board game where survival depended on one flawless move. The cabin behind them offered limited cover. The tree line provided concealment, but also traps of ice and uneven ground. To the east, a narrow ravine cut toward lower terrain, its sides steep enough to slow horses. To the west, a frozen creek bed ran beneath a lip of snow, hidden from view unless one knew where to step. Rowan shifted forward slightly, his body taking the position of a shield by habit. The king in him recognized assault. The father in him recognized threat to his son. The man in him recognized the cost of every heartbeat that hesitated. The lead rider raised an arm and signaled. More riders spread outward, forming a half-circle designed to trap. Behind them, a figure appeared slower, deliberate, moving at the center of confidence. Even from a distance, Rowan recognized the posture. Magnus Dreyer did not rush because he believed time belonged to him. The moment before impact stretched thin. Elara used it without wasting breath. She moved Calum subtly toward the cabin's side wall, positioning him near the back corner, where a small supply hatch opened toward the frozen creek bed. She did not issue panicked commands. Her movements were calm and precise, the kind of calm that steadied the air around her. It was not submission. It was leadership. The ambush erupted without warning from the flanks. Two riders dismounted quickly and advanced on foot, forcing distance between Rowan and the cabin door. Another pair moved to cut off the tree-line route. The trap tightened. Rowan reacted with fierce efficiency. He did not waste energy on threats or speeches. He moved to disrupt the formation. Stepping into the open space where the riders expected him to hesitate, his presence flared, alpha authority expanding in a way that made lesser wolves stiffen. In Ashenfall, that aura alone would have ended resistance. Here, under council orders, it only slowed them. Elara watched the pattern and understood their weakness. They were organized, but they were also rigid. They expected Rowan to fight like a king protecting a throne. They did not expect an Omega to think like terrain itself. She guided Calum toward the hatch with one hand at his shoulder, the other gesturing for Rowan to angle slightly right, drawing the attackers away from the west side. Rowan noticed. He did not question. He moved with it, using his own authority as distraction. The shift was subtle but vital. It created space. Calum's expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened as the pressure escalated. His breathing stayed controlled, the way Elara had trained him through storms and hunger. He did not panic. He measured. One attacker pushed too close, reaching toward Elara's side as if to seize her for leverage. The movement was quick, calculated to destabilize Rowan. Elara rotated out of reach, using the attacker's momentum to redirect him into deeper snow. She did not escalate into needless brutality. She simply removed him as immediate threat and kept moving. That was when Calum's power rose. It did not explode. It did not lash wildly. It surged outward in a controlled wave, dense and commanding, like the sudden drop in air pressure before a storm breaks. The nearby attackers froze, their bodies responding instinctively to dominance far beyond their rank. Horses stamped nervously. Wolves on foot hesitated mid-step, eyes widening as their instincts screamed to obey. Rowan felt it as sharply as anyone. The aura rolling from Calum was unmistakable, and it carried something Rowan had not felt in years: authority without cruelty. It stunned not by fear, but by certainty. For a moment, the clearing fell quiet under the weight of it, as if the world itself recognized its rightful center. Magnus's voice carried across the distance then, cold and measured, designed to reclaim control of the narrative. He spoke in declarations rather than conversation, ensuring every soldier around him understood the story they were meant to believe. Rowan was described as unstable, compromised by grief, reckless enough to abandon the kingdom. The disappearance of the heir was framed as proof of Rowan's failure. In Magnus's framing, regency was not ambition. It was duty. The council, he implied, could no longer allow a broken king to endanger Ashenfall. Rowan's jaw tightened as he listened, not because he was surprised, but because he heard how easily the kingdom's fear could be shaped into loyalty for the wrong man. Magnus was not just ordering an ambush, he was announcing a transfer of power. Elara did not waste energy reacting to the words. Words were for palaces. Here, movement mattered. She took advantage of the hesitation Calum's aura created. She pushed open the supply hatch and guided Calum through first, into the narrow crawl space leading toward the frozen creek bed. She then looked to Rowan, her gaze sharp with instruction. The route was tight, but it was their only path that horses could not immediately follow. Rowan moved toward her, still holding the attacker's attention with his stance and presence. He did not retreat like prey. He retreated like strategy. He backed toward the cabin's side, forcing the council guards to reposition if they wanted to keep him trapped. That repositioning cost them seconds. Seconds were everything. A rider attempted to close the gap, but the ground beneath his horse's hooves gave slightly. The animal stumbled, and that brief disruption broke the clean half-circle. Elara seized the opening immediately, slipping through with Rowan behind her. They dropped into the hatch space and moved quickly, the cold earth beneath them packed hard. The narrow tunnel forced them close, shoulder to shoulder, stripped of hierarchy. Rowan could feel Elara's steady breathing beside him, her focus unwavering. It struck him then with uncomfortable clarity that without her, his son would already be dead. Without her, this escape would not exist. The Omega he condemned was now the only reason he still had a future worth fighting for. They emerged into the creek bed beyond the cabin, hidden under a thin overhang of snow. The world above remained loud with movement and shouted orders, but down here, sound muffled, giving them a moment of cover. Ilara's eyes scanned the creek bed's path, already calculating the safest turn points, the areas where ice was thick enough to bear their weight without cracking. Then the wolves arrived. They did not appear as a miracle. They appeared as inevitability. Shadows moved along the ridgeline above, silent shapes with eyes like pale fire. Rogue wolves, unclaimed by Ashenfall's hierarchy, slipped down the slope and formed a protective arc around Calum, their bodies angled outward, their attention fixed on the threat behind. They did not snarl wildly. They watched with disciplined readiness, as if awaiting the command of the young alpha they had already chosen. Calum's presence shifted again, calmer now, guiding rather than pressing. The wolves responded, moving with him as if they had trained together for years. It was clear to Rowan that Calum's authority did not require force. It inspired allegiance. The trio moved along the creek bed until the trees thickened enough to mask their trail. Only then did Elara allow herself to slow slightly, checking Calum's posture, ensuring his breathing stayed steady. She did not collapse into relief. She treated survival as a continuing task. Rowan watched her under pressure and felt something inside him rearrange. In Ashenfall, Omegas were taught to endure quietly, to support from the margins. Elara was not enduring. She was directing. She was keeping them alive through intelligence, restraint, and instinct that outperformed the Council's disciplined violence. It was leadership, undeniable and untraditional. And Rowan realized with bitter clarity that the kingdom's hierarchy had blinded him to the strongest kind of strength. They could not remain in the borderlands. The ambush proved Magnus would not stop hunting. The council now had a story ready to sell. The king had fled, the heir was gone, the traitorous Omega had corrupted him. If Magnus reached the throne publicly, he would use Ashenfall's fear to legitimize his coup, and any resistance would be crushed under the banner of stability. Rowan understood what had to come next. They would have to reclaim Ashenfall, not with brute dominance, but with truth. Elara's evidence could fracture Magnus's narrative, but only if revealed before Magnus cemented control. Calum's existence would rally loyalists, but only if they reached the right wolves before the council spread its own propaganda. The plan formed in fragments as they moved, each of them holding different pieces. Rowan carried authority and legacy, still powerful despite the council's betrayal. Elara carried proof and strategy, the clearest mind among them. Calum carried the future, a living symbol capable of shifting allegiance without bloodshed. Behind them, in Ashenfall, Magnus acted swiftly. He returned to the palace before Rowan could. He stood before the council and the gathered nobles and announced the king had turned traitor, abandoning his post and conspiring with the exiled Omega. He claimed regency for the good of the kingdom, his words wrapped in duty, while ambition gleamed beneath. Then he delivered the final move designed to sever loyalty permanently. A public decree spread through Ashenfall's streets by dawn, stamped with council authority and sealed with official insignia. The execution date for the traitorous king was set, and as Rowan, Elara, and Calum disappeared deeper into the borderlands, with wolves moving like shadows around them, the kingdom they needed to save began preparing to kill the man who once ruled it. The wilderness did not offer comfort, but it offered space to think. Once the immediate threat of the ambush faded behind them, Ilara guided Rowan and Calum into terrain where sound carried poorly, and tracks disappeared quickly. The rogue wolves that had followed Calum moved like a living perimeter, never crowding too close, never leaving too wide an opening. They were not pets and not soldiers. They were a force-answering instinct. Every time, Calum's presence steadied. Their formation steadied with him, as if the future had already begun arranging itself around the boy. They sheltered in the hollow of a rocky outcrop that cut the wind and concealed firelight. Rowan wanted to move directly toward Ashenfall to reclaim control before Magnus could solidify his story. Ilara knew that speed without strategy would turn them into targets again. Magnus held the palace. He held the council. He held the official narrative. Charging at those walls would not be bravery. It would be surrender dressed up as pride. Ilara's plan began with a truth Ashenfall refused to acknowledge. The kingdom was not held together by alphas. It was held together by everyone the alphas overlooked. Omegas managed kitchens, infirmaries, storerooms, laundry routes, and private quarters. Betas maintained patrol schedules, supply ledgers, stable rotations, and guard shifts. The lower ranks were treated as background, yet they were the bloodstream of the fortress. If Ilara could reach them, she could move through Ashenfall without fighting its strongest walls. She could turn the kingdom's invisibility into her advantage. Rowan listened at first with tension in his posture, as though the idea of relying on Omegas and Betas felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. He had ruled through hierarchy for so long that it was difficult for him to imagine power emerging from below. Yet the last days had forced humility into him the way the borderlands forced endurance. His crown meant nothing out here. His authority could not protect his son. Only Ilara's decisions had done that. When she spoke of building a network from the forgotten ranks, Rowan did not interrupt. He watched her carefully, seeing how her mind moved 3 steps ahead, how she calculated without panic. That observation planted a shift in him, subtle but deep. For the first time, he began allowing someone else to steer the course. Not because he was weak, but because he finally recognized strength he had been trained to dismiss. Ilara's next move was riskier. She knew the kingdom would not rally behind whispers alone. Fear could silence lower ranks as easily as it could empower them. Ashenfall needed a symbol stronger than Magnus's propaganda, something undeniable enough to fracture obedience. That symbol was Calum. Calum had been hidden for years. Revealing him now would ignite pursuit, but it would also ignite loyalty. A living heir carried more power than any decree. Ilara understood that Calum's presence would not only reassure the kingdom's uncertain wolves, it would also expose Magnus's lie at its foundation. She chose a gathering place carefully, an old stone circle used by rogue packs as neutral ground. Far enough from Ashenfall to avoid immediate capture, but close enough for whispers to travel back quickly. The wolves arrived in cautious groups, drawn by rumor and by something deeper they could not name. Some came suspicious, expecting trap. Others came curious, drawn by the myth of the young alpha, whose aura commanded without cruelty. Rowan stood at the edge of the circle, hood pulled low, watching faces as they arrived. He recognized some as outcast descendants of Pax Ashenfall had pushed away. He recognized others as scouts from territories that had once pledged loyalty to him. Their eyes flicked toward him with uncertain recognition, but no one spoke. They waited for proof. Ilara stepped forward, not with royal ceremony, but with grounded authority. She did not present Rowan as king. She presented truth as the center of gravity. Then Calem moved beside her. The shift in the air was immediate. The young Alpha's presence unfolded, controlled, but vast, filling the stone circle like a tide. Wolves froze, then lowered their heads instinctively, not in forced submission but in recognition of something legitimate. Calum's gaze moved across them calmly, carrying none of the arrogance Ashenfall trained into heirs. He did not posture. He did not demand. He simply existed, and that existence answered every question. The emotional turning point came not through shouting or ritual, but through silence. Wolves who had lived under Ashenfall's dominance felt something unfamiliar in his aura, steadiness without threat. It promised strength without humiliation. It suggested a future where hierarchy did not have to mean cruelty. Rowan watched his son and felt both pride and discomfort. Calem's authority had been shaped by an Omega's guidance, not by Alpha tradition. The future Ashenfall needed was standing in front of him, and it did not look like the past he built. When Calem revealed the simple truth of his survival through presence rather than proclamation, allegiance began shifting in real time. Rogues who hated Ashenfall's oppression began considering alliance. Scouts who had doubted Rowan's stability began reconsidering Magnus's narrative. The stone circle became the birthplace of a quiet coalition, bound not by rank but by shared recognition that Ashenfall was being stolen from within. With support forming outside, Ilara moved to ignite support inside. The key was the palace's forgotten corridors, the place's lower ranks traveled without being seen. Ilara knew them intimately from her years serving within Ashenfall. She remembered which stairwells bypassed main halls, which storage tunnels connected kitchens to guard quarters, which laundry routes passed behind council chambers. The fortress had been designed for efficiency, and that efficiency would now be used against its corrupt leadership. She began sending messages through couriers who could travel unseen, lone betas who had once served as stable hands, omegas who moved through markets without drawing notice, healers who could carry sealed notes in medicinal bundles. The messages were simple, written in coded phrasing only palace staff would recognize, referencing shift changes and supply counts that meant nothing to outsiders but everything to those who lived within the fortress machine. Inside Ashenfall, the lower ranks were already tense. Magnus's regency had increased scrutiny. Patrols doubled. Punishments became more public. The council's paranoia made daily life heavier. Yet the same paranoia also created cracks, because fear made rulers overreach. Magnus underestimated the people he ignored. He believed Omegas would remain silent. He believed neglected betas would cling to stability rather than risk rebellion. He forgot that those who endure the most often learn the most about surviving systems designed to crush them. Elara's messages reached the right hands first. An older Omega who worked in the infirmary and had once quietly helped Elara when she was accused. A beta quartermaster whose ledgers hid more than supply counts. A young kitchen worker who had watched guards whisper about the heir's disappearance and had never believed the official story. These allies did not gather openly. They coordinated through routine. A basket left in the wrong hallway, a lantern lit in a certain window. A guard shift mistakenly reassigned. Elara's coalition inside the palace grew without Magnus noticing. It did not grow through speeches. It grew through small acts of defiance hidden within the system's own rhythms. The infiltration plan formed with precision. Rowan would remain outside the walls with the coalition of rogues and loyal scouts, ready to move when the signal came. Calum would stay protected until the last moment, because revealing him too early inside the fortress could trigger panic before allies were positioned. Elara would be the spear point, not because she was expendable, but because she was the only one who could move through Ashenfall's understructure without being questioned immediately. Rowan accepted the plan with a silence that spoke louder than pride. Allowing Elara to lead was not easy for him, but it was necessary. He watched her organize routes, assign roles, anticipate council responses. Each decision she made forced him to confront how much the kingdom had lost by dismissing Omega's strength. His respect was no longer theoretical. It was earned through survival. On the chosen night, the coalition inside Ashenfall began shifting the fortress from within. Guards were redirected subtly away from key corridors. Storeroom locks were left unlatched at strategic points. Messenger routes were altered to delay council updates. The palace remained outwardly calm, but beneath the surface it was being reshaped by hands Magnus had never considered dangerous. Elara slipped through a supply tunnel beneath the outer wall, her hood pulled low, her steps silent. She moved past the kitchens where steam and spice masked scent, past the laundry rooms where linen carts created mobile cover, past the servant stairwell that led directly toward the royal wing. Every corridor carried memory. Every turn echoed with the injustice of her exile. Yet she did not allow bitterness to slow her. She treated each memory like fuel. Magnus, unaware of the network closing around him, continued preparing his public consolidation of power. He focused on the upcoming execution announcement, believing fear would finalize loyalty. He believed the kingdom's lower ranks were too weak to challenge him. He believed the story belonged to whoever spoke loudest from the throne. Elara reached the final corridor leading to the throne chamber. 2 guards stood outside, but they were not fully alert. Their posture suggested confusion, as if shift orders had been changed too many times. A subtle signal from a nearby servant confirmed what Elara needed. The path was open. She adjusted her cloak, steadied her breathing, and stepped forward with calm inevitability. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Each step carried purpose, not panic. Behind her, in hidden corridors and shadowed rooms, the forgotten ranks of Ashenfall held their positions, waiting for the moment truth would break through the palace walls. Elara reached the throne chamber doors, and without looking back, she pushed them open and walked in alone. The throne chamber of Ashenfall had always been designed to intimidate. High-vaulted ceilings stretched above black stone pillars, carved with the lineage of Alpha rulers. Torches burned in disciplined symmetry along the walls, their flames reflecting against polished floors like controlled fire beneath ice. The throne itself stood elevated on a carved dais, an architectural reminder that power flowed downward. When Elara stepped inside alone, the chamber was already filled. Council members lined the lower steps of the dais. Noble families stood in rigid clusters, their expressions carefully neutral. Guards positioned along the perimeter shifted uneasily at the sight of her, some recognizing her immediately, others only recalling the scandal that had once exiled her beyond the borderlands. At the center, seated upon the throne with calculated composure, stood Chancellor Magnus Dreyer, draped in ceremonial regent colors, as if the role had always belonged to him. A ripple of whispers moved through the hall. The Omega who had been condemned, the traitor who vanished, the impossible return. Elara did not lower her gaze. She walked forward until she stood beneath the dais, precisely where accused wolves were meant to stand during sentencing. The symbolism was deliberate. She had once been judged here without trial. Now she had come to deliver one. Magnus regarded her with cool amusement, as though her presence confirmed rather than threatened his narrative. His posture suggested control, but there was tension in the stillness of his hands. He had expected resistance eventually. He had not expected confrontation in his own chamber. Before he could speak, the heavy doors at the back of the throne hall opened again. Rowan Halcrest entered first. Gasps filled the chamber. The king, long declared unstable, possibly dead, now stood alive and unrestrained. He did not storm in with fury. He walked with steady authority, flanked not by council guards but by wolves who had pledged loyalty in the stone circle. Behind him came Calum. The moment the young Alpha stepped fully into the hall, the air changed. His presence expanded, not violently, not recklessly, but undeniably. It rolled through the chamber like a rising tide, brushing against every Alpha, Beta, and Omega present. Wolves who had never bowed to anyone, but Rowan felt their instincts pull toward Calum, heads lowered without conscious decision. Murmurs died in throats. The air was alive. Magnus rose slowly from the throne, attempting to reassert control through posture alone. He moved as though surprised but not shaken, already shaping language to reframe the moment. Yet the foundation of his authority cracked visibly. His regency had been built upon absence. That absence now stood breathing before the entire kingdom. Elara stepped forward, her movements precise and unhurried. She placed a wrapped bundle at the foot of the dais and unfolded it with calm finality. The blade bearing Ashenfall's royal crest gleamed beneath torchlight. The wax seal followed. The strip of palace dyed cloth completed the pattern. The hall grew impossibly still. Evidence did not shout. It did not argue. It simply existed. The insignia were unmistakable. The crest was authentic. The seal belonged to council correspondence. These were not relics recovered from outsiders. They were pieces of Ashenfall's own machinery. Rowan did not speak immediately. His silence was heavier than accusation. His gaze fixed on Magnus, not with rage, but with clarity sharpened by regret. The truth he once refused to investigate now lay undeniable before him. Magnus attempted composure, dismissing the items with calculated skepticism, suggesting fabrication, suggesting conspiracy between exiled traitor and unstable king. But the tone of his defense lacked the quiet certainty he once wielded. Wolves in the chamber began exchanging glances. Doubt moved quickly when power shifted. Then Calum stepped forward. He did not climb the dais. He did not attempt to seize the throne. He simply stood beside Elara and let his presence settle once more. When he looked out across the chamber, it was not with contempt. It was with measured disappointment. The ideology Ashenfall had worshipped for generations trembled under that gaze. Calum's aura carried strength without humiliation, authority without cruelty. Wolves, who had grown under dominance-based hierarchy, felt the difference instinctively. For the first time, they sensed what leadership might feel like without fear as its foundation. The chamber was not only witnessing proof of Magnus's treason, it was witnessing an alternative to the system that allowed it. Rowan moved then, slowly ascending the dais steps, not toward Magnus, but toward Elara. The entire hall watched. When he reached her, He did something no alphaking in Ashenfall's history had ever done. He lowered himself to one knee before her. The movement was deliberate, visible to every wolf in the chamber. It was not submission in weakness, it was acknowledgement in strength. Rowan bowed his head not to an Omega rank, but to Elara Vale, the woman who had preserved his heir uncovered treason, and united the kingdom's forgotten ranks when he had failed to see them. Shock rippled through the nobles. The symbolic reversal struck deeper than any weapon could. An Alpha King kneeling before an Omega shattered centuries of rigid hierarchy in a single gesture. Elara did not step back. She did not appear triumphant. She accepted the acknowledgement with the same steadiness she had shown in exile. In that moment, Ashenfall's definition of power shifted irreversibly. Magnus saw the chamber slipping from his control. Desperation cracked through his composure. He signaled sharply to a group of guards still loyal to him, ordering containment before the narrative could solidify fully. The movement was swift, calculated to reclaim dominance through force. If he could capture Calum or silence Rowan publicly, fear might still override doubt. Guards advanced toward the dais. Elara reacted before panic could spread. She stepped subtly in front of Calum, positioning herself as barrier without drawing attention to the gesture. It was instinct, the same instinct that had once shielded him in a frozen cabin. Rowan rose immediately, placing himself at her side. But it was Calum who ended the escalation. His aura surged again, controlled yet immense. It pressed outward, not crushing, but commanding. The advancing guards faltered mid-step, their bodies responding to alpha authority too strong to deny. Even wolves loyal to Magnus hesitated, their instincts colliding with the legitimacy standing before them. The hall held its breath. Magnus attempted to override instinct with command, but his voice lacked resonance against the tide of presence filling the chamber. His power had always relied on manipulation and narrative. Against raw legitimacy and visible truth, it faltered. Internal palace allies chose that moment to move. Guards whose shifts had been quietly reassigned stepped between Magnus's loyalists and the dais. Betas who managed inner corridors sealed exits behind the Chancellor's supporters. The coalition Elara built from the forgotten ranks revealed itself not in chaos, but in coordinated precision. Magnus found himself isolated. The defeat was not theatrical. It unfolded with the inevitability of a collapsing structure that had been rotting from within. Wolves who once feared council authority now saw it stripped of illusion. The evidence lay visible. The heir stood alive. The king acknowledged his failure openly, and the Omega once condemned had proven stronger than every accusation. Magnus's final attempt at control dissolved into silence as guards disarmed him under Rowan's direct order. The throne chamber, once designed to reinforce hierarchy, now bore witness to its transformation. The Chancellor who had nearly stolen Ashenfall was exposed not through violence, but through truth made undeniable. As Magnus was escorted away, the chamber remained quiet, not stunned, but recalibrating. All eyes turned to Rowan. He stood before the throne that had defined his identity for years. He looked at Calum, whose future now stretched far beyond old systems. He looked at Elara, whose leadership had already reshaped the kingdom's foundation. He looked at the gathered wolves, waiting not for dominance but for direction. Rowan understood that reclaiming the crown was not enough. Restoring Ashenfall required more than removing Magnus. It required dismantling the ideology that made betrayal possible. He stepped toward the throne, not to sit, but to make a decision that would redefine the kingdom. And as he opened his mouth to speak, Every wolf in Ashenfall sensed that whatever he declared next would change their world forever. Ashenfall did not heal in a single day. The palace remained the same structure of stone and torchlight, but its air felt altered, as if the walls themselves had been forced to remember everything they once helped conceal. After Magnus Dreyer's exposure, the kingdom entered a tense quiet, the kind that followed a storm when broken branches still littered the ground. Guards were repositioned, council seats reassigned, and decrees rewritten. Wolves who had sworn loyalty to the chancellor out of fear now stood uncertain, watching which direction the crown would turn. Rowan Halcrest understood that keeping the throne would be the easiest choice, and perhaps the most dangerous. The kingdom had been trained for centuries to treat power as something fixed, something inherited, something enforced. If he remained seated as if nothing had changed, Ashenfall would interpret the upheaval as a brief disruption, not a necessary transformation. The rot would return in another form, because the structure that allowed it would remain intact. So Rowan stepped down from active rule temporarily, not as surrender, but as a deliberate act of reform. He retained his title as king, yet publicly withdrew from day-to-day governance and ordered a provisional council formed with representation that Ashenfall had never seen. Betas were given seats based on merit rather than rank. Omegas were appointed into advisory positions tied directly to court operations, not as ceremonial figures but as decision-makers. Supply systems, patrol rotations, and judicial hearings were restructured so no single chancellor could consolidate power unseen. The execution decree Magnus had issued was reversed publicly, and the record of Elara's exile was struck from official archives, not quietly, but in full view of the same hall that once condemned her. The reforms did not come without resistance. Some noble families grumbled about tradition. Some elders argued that hierarchy was the kingdom's foundation. Yet Rowan's authority, sharpened by the humiliation of his failure, no longer served tradition blindly. He used it to enforce change. He made it clear that Ashenfall would not return to the comfort of old cruelty simply because it was familiar. Calum watched all of it with a calm maturity that unsettled those who expected a young alpha to demand immediate power. He did not rush toward the throne. He did not treat his survival as entitlement. Instead, he moved through the palace like someone studying it for the first time. He listened to workers in kitchens and stables. He spent time with patrol captains and healers. He observed which faces tightened when Omega spoke, which voices softened when they realized the heir was not interested in dominance games. When asked indirectly about succession, Calum made his position clear through action. He accepted a transitional role as heir, not as figurehead, but as learner, training under multiple ranks rather than only alpha mentors. His choice signaled something Ashenfall had never seen: leadership as balance rather than conquest. Wolves began to adjust their posture around him, not because they feared him, but because they sensed he would not misuse them. In the midst of rebuilding, Rowan found that the loudest conflict was not political. It was personal. Elara Vale had become a name spoken throughout the kingdom, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with disbelief. Omegas, in particular, looked at her as proof that silence was not their only survival tool. Betas began questioning why their competence had always been treated as lesser than alpha birthright. Even some alphas, shaken by Magnus's betrayal, began to wonder how many other truths had been buried beneath hierarchy. Elara did not seek praise. She accepted the reforms with quiet practicality, moving into the role offered to her in the new governance structure with minimal ceremony. She did not look hungry for position. She looked focused on preventing the kingdom from sliding back into the same patterns. She assisted in rebuilding patrol protocols, advised on internal accountability measures, and ensured that the lower ranks who had risked everything to help her were not discarded once their usefulness ended. Rowan watched her from a distance for days before he allowed himself to approach. He had always been a king who confronted threats directly, yet he found himself hesitant now. No battlefield felt as dangerous as standing before the Omega he had condemned and admitting the truth without authority to hide behind. When he finally chose to go to her, he did not go as king. He left the palace at dusk, wearing no ceremonial cloak, no crown, no insignia. He took only a small escort that stayed far back, their presence less for protection and more to witness what he intended to do. He walked through Eschenfall's outer corridors and into the quieter residential area where Elara had been given modest quarters. Simple, warm, and intentionally away from the throne hall's heavy symbolism. It felt like the first space in the palace that belonged to her, rather than to rank Rowan stopped outside her door. For a long moment he did not lift his hand. He stared at the wood grain, listening to the muted sounds inside. His breathing slowed, controlled, not because he feared Elara's anger, but because he feared her absence. Forgiveness was not something a king could order. It had to be offered. And he had not earned it with apology alone. When he finally knocked, it was quiet, almost hesitant. Elara opened the door without surprise, as if she had sensed his approach long before his footsteps reached her corridor. She regarded him in silence, her expression calm but guarded. She did not look frightened. She did not look impressed. She looked like someone who had survived too much to be moved by symbolism. Rowan stood before her, with no throne behind him, no counsel at his shoulders. He was simply a man who had made a choice that nearly killed his son and destroyed the only person who protected him. He did not speak in dramatic confession. He acknowledged, through his posture, through the way his shoulders lowered slightly, that he had come to her on different terms. He held out his hands, empty, showing he carried no decree, no command. In that gesture he admitted what he had never admitted in court, that power without truth was hollow. Elara did not step back, but she did not step forward either. The space between them carried years of pain compressed into quiet tension. She remembered the cold bite of exile. She remembered the sound of Ashenfall's gates closing behind her. She remembered the humiliation of being accused without proof. Those memories did not vanish simply because the kingdom had shifted. Rowan's eyes moved briefly toward the interior behind her, where Caelim's presence could be felt even if he remained unseen. The boy's aura was calm, steady, quietly watchful. Rowan understood then that Elara had not only kept Caelim alive, she had shaped him into the kind of heir Ashenfall had never deserved. If Rowan had raised him alone within old traditions, Caelim might have become another version of the same rigid dominance that allowed Magnus to thrive. Elara had broken that cycle without ever calling it rebellion. Rowan lowered himself then, not abruptly, but with deliberate intention. In the corridor, visible to the distant escort and to any passing servants, he bowed at her door the way he once bowed in the throne hall. It was not performative this time. It was personal. It was a public acknowledgement that the strongest act an alphaking could commit was not conquest, but humility. The corridor stilled. Servants who happened to pass slowed, eyes widening, witnessing a moment Ashenfall's history would not be able to erase. The king was not bowing to rank, he was bowing to the truth that had kept his bloodline alive. Elara's throat tightened, not with triumph, but with something more complicated. She had wanted justice, and justice had arrived. Yet justice did not automatically heal betrayal. It did not erase the nights she spent binding wounds in silence, or the years she spent teaching a prince how to breathe through fear instead of becoming it. Rowan lifted his gaze, and in it was something Elara had never seen from him before. A willingness to be refused without turning refusal into punishment. He did not reach for her. He waited. Inside, Kalum shifted, and the air changed slightly, as if the boy understood the weight of the decision unfolding. This was not only about a king and an omega. It was about what the new Ashenfall would become. If Ilara accepted Rowan, it would signal reconciliation strong enough to anchor reform. If she turned away, it would be a reminder that change had consequences no decree could erase. Ilara studied Rowan's face, searching for the familiar arrogance that once ruled it. She found none. She found exhaustion, regret, and a steady determination that did not ask to be forgiven, only to be allowed to earn it. She took one slow breath, then another. Her fingers lifted slightly, hesitant, as if reaching forward might reopen wounds she had spent years sealing. And as she reached for Rowan's hand, the entire kingdom felt the moment turning into history, waiting to see whether forgiveness would seal a new dynasty, or whether destiny still held one final trial in reserve. The kingdom that once silenced her now speaks her name with reverence, because the Omega they called weak rebuilt their future from the ashes of betrayal. The Alpha King who ruled through pride learned that true strength bows to truth, not dominance. The heir raised in exile returned not as a weapon, but as a leader shaped by balance and mercy. Ashenfall did not fall because power changed hands. It rose because power finally changed its meaning. And in the quiet after the storm, love, not fear, became the foundation of a new dynasty. Inside, Kalum shifted, and the air changed slightly, as if the boy understood the weight of the decision unfolding. This was not only about a king and an omega. It was about what the new Ashenfall would become. If Ilara accepted Rowan, it would signal reconciliation strong enough to anchor reform. If she turned away, it would be a reminder that change had consequences no decree could erase. Ilara studied Rowan's face, searching for the familiar arrogance that once ruled it. She found none. She found exhaustion, regret, and a steady determination that did not ask to be forgiven, only to be allowed to earn it. She took one slow breath, then another. Her fingers lifted slightly, hesitant, as if reaching forward might reopen wounds she had spent years sealing. And as she reached for Rowan's hand, the entire kingdom felt the moment turning into history, waiting to see whether forgiveness would seal a new dynasty, or whether destiny still held one final trial in reserve. The kingdom that once silenced her now speaks her name with reverence, because the Omega they called weak rebuilt their future from the ashes of betrayal. The Alpha King who ruled through pride learned that true strength bows to truth, not dominance. The heir raised in exile returned not as a weapon, but as a leader shaped by balance and mercy. Ashenfall did not fall because power changed hands. It rose because power finally changed its meaning. And in the quiet after the storm, love, not fear, became the foundation of a new dynasty. If this story moved you, if you believe strength should be redefined and loyalty should be earned, not demanded, pass this legend on to someone who still believes power only belongs to the loudest voice. Stay close to stories that challenge crowns, question hierarchies, and turn the forgotten into forces no kingdom can ignore. There's more rising where this came from, because the next exile might change everything again. Now tell me, what country are you watching from?